top engineers failed to fix the billionaire's private helicopter until a homeless girl did. The hangar doors were wide open, yet the air inside felt heavy, charged with frustration and disbelief. A multi-million-dollar private helicopter sat grounded in the center of the vast space, its sleek white body mocking everyone who stood around it. Tools lay scattered on metal tables, diagnostic screens blinked with unreadable data, and a group of elite engineers stood frozen, hands on their heads, staring at the machine they could not fix. This helicopter was supposed to fly the billionaire to a critical meeting within the hour. A meeting that could shift markets and collapse deals, but instead, it had become an expensive, silent failure. The billionaire stood closest to the aircraft. His sharp eyes locked onto the exposed engine mounted on a workbench beside the helicopter. He had trusted the best in the industry, flown them in from different states, paid them without hesitation. Every single one of them had given the same answer: nothing more could be done. The problem was unidentifiable, too complex, possibly systemic. Words that meant nothing to a man who was used to solutions, not excuses. His jaw tightened as seconds slipped away. Time for him had always been something money could bend. Today, it refused. Then, unnoticed at first, a small figure stood near the edge of the hangar. She didn't belong there. Her clothes were worn and torn at the seams, her face marked with dirt and long nights without rest. She looked impossibly out of place among polished floors, expensive equipment, and uniformed professionals. She was a homeless girl, no older than 12 or 13, who had wandered inside while the guards were distracted by the chaos. She watched silently as men with years of education argued in low voices, pointing at wires, sensors, and parts she didn't yet have names for, but somehow understood. The engineers were so focused on their own failure that none of them noticed her step closer. The girl's eyes moved differently than theirs. She didn't scan the engine with frustration. She studied it with curiosity. Her gaze lingered on a specific section where a cluster of wires bent unnaturally, pressed too tightly against a metal housing. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening, remembering. This wasn't the first machine she had seen broken. Life on the streets had taught her how to fix things that couldn't be replaced: radios, generators, old bikes. Anything that still had a heartbeat left inside it. The billionaire finally noticed her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the noise like a blade. "I know what's wrong." Every conversation stopped. The engineers turned at once, disbelief written across their faces. A few laughed under their breath, assuming they had misheard her. The billionaire looked down at the girl, surprised not by her words, but by the certainty behind them. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't trying to impress. She was stating a fact. One of the engineers stepped forward, irritation flashing in his eyes, ready to dismiss her. But the billionaire raised a hand, stopping him. Something about the moment felt different. The room had gone still in a way that couldn't be explained. "What do you think is wrong?" the billionaire asked, his tone controlled but curious. The girl didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer to the engine, her bare hands hovering just above the metal. The engineers watched in shock as she pointed directly to a component none of them had questioned. Minor alignment bracket connected to a sensor array. "It's not broken," she said. "It's confused." The word made no sense to the professionals, yet it sent a strange ripple through the room. She explained, slowly and carefully, that when parts were forced back in the wrong order after maintenance, the system kept sending false signals. The helicopter thought it was protecting itself. That's why it refused to start. The billionaire felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Hope. And as the engineers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that none of them had considered this possibility, the homeless girl reached forward, ready to prove that she was right about, to change everything they thought they knew. The engineers instinctively moved to stop her. Years of training screamed that no unauthorized person, especially a child, should be anywhere. near a multi-million-dollar aircraft engine. One of them took a step forward, hand raised, ready to intervene. But once again, the billionaire lifted his hand, this time more firmly. His eyes never left the girl. "Let her speak," he said. The girl flinched slightly at the sudden attention, but didn't back away. Up close, the contrast was even sharper. Her hands were small, roughened by survival rather than workbenches. Dirt clung beneath her nails, and her sleeves were torn at the elbows. Yet the way she looked at the engine wasn't reckless. It was precise, familiar, as if this machine spoke a language she had learned the hard way. She pointed again, more clearly now, tracing the path of a wire with her finger without touching it. "This sensor thinks the rotor's out of sync," she explained. "But it's not. The bracket here is twisted just enough to send the wrong message. The system locks itself down so nothing explodes." The hangar fell into an uneasy silence. One of the senior engineers frowned and pulled up the diagnostic feed on his tablet, scrolling rapidly. He muttered something under his breath, then frowned deeper. Another engineer leaned over his shoulder. Then another. Their confident posture began to crack. The data they had dismissed earlier suddenly looked different. "That reading shouldn't be there," one of them said quietly. The billionaire felt his pulse quicken. He had seen this moment before in boardrooms, when certainty collapses and truth begins to surface. He stepped closer to the engine, standing beside the girl now, towering over her but no longer intimidating. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, but you have to loosen it, not replace it. If you replace it, it'll keep happening." The engineers exchanged looks of disbelief, mixed with reluctant respect. One of them cleared his throat. She's not wrong," he admitted. "The alignment tolerance here is extremely narrow. We assumed failure, not miscommunication." The billionaire exhaled slowly. For the first time that day, the weight on his chest eased. "Then do it," he said. "Exactly how she says." Tools moved again, this time with purpose. The girl stepped back, watching closely as the engineers adjusted the bracket by a fraction of a degree, so small it seemed impossible that it could ground an aircraft. When they powered the system back on, the diagnostic alarms vanished one by one. A low hum filled the hangar, then a steady, powerful whir. The helicopter came alive. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound alone said everything. The machine they had declared impossible to fix was now fully operational, responding perfectly. One engineer laughed in disbelief. Another removed his headset slowly, as if waking from a dream. The billionaire stared at the helicopter, then down at the girl. "You just saved more than a flight," he said quietly. She shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. "Machines just need to be listened to," she replied. "People don't do that enough." Those words struck deeper than she could have known. Security finally noticed her then, rushing over, ready to escort her out. The billionaire turned sharply. "Stop," he said. "She's a guest." The guards froze. He crouched down so he was eye level with her. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Lena. Do you have family, Lena?" he asked gently. She shook her head. The billionaire straightened slowly, a decision forming not driven by impulse, but by clarity. This wasn't charity. This wasn't guilt. This was recognition. He looked around at the engineers, the helicopter, the hangar built on wealth and expertise. Then he looked back at the girl who had solved what money couldn't. "Everything changes from here," he said, not to her, but to himself. The helicopter was slowly rolled back into its marked position at the center of the hangar, its systems now operating in perfect synchronization. The steady mechanical hum filled the space, no longer a sound of frustration but of resolution. Engineers moved deliberately around the aircraft, double-checking readings they now trusted again. Yet despite the return of order, something invisible had changed. The hangar no longer felt like a place where authority ruled unquestioned. It felt like a place where assumptions had been exposed. The billionaire stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching everything unfold. For years he had surrounded himself with experts, people whose confidence came from credentials, titles, and experience. He respected them, paid them well, and trusted their judgment. But what he had witnessed today shook a belief he didn't even realize he still carried. That brilliance always followed a predictable path. Lena had shattered that illusion without raising her voice or demanding attention. She had simply seen what others had missed. Lena, meanwhile, stood near the edge of the hangar again, instinctively drifting back into invisibility now that the crisis was resolved. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her posture shaped by years of trying not to be noticed. She assumed her usefulness had ended the moment the helicopter started working. In her world, help was rarely rewarded with permanence. It was borrowed time at best. One of the younger engineers glanced at her, then at the engine, then back at her again. He felt something close to embarrassment. He remembered how quickly he had dismissed her presence, how confidently he had believed that no solution could exist outside their collective expertise. He walked over, hesitated, then spoke. "You were right," he said simply. "We didn't even think to check that alignment." Lena nodded, unsure how to respond. Praise was unfamiliar territory. The billionaire noticed this exchange. He also noticed how none of the senior engineers argued anymore, how their body language had shifted from defensiveness to reflection. This was not humiliation, it was growth. And it was rare. He motioned for his chief engineer to join him. "Document what happened today," he said. "Not just the fix. The process. The assumption that caused the failure." The chief engineer blinked. "You want that in the report?" "Yes," the billionaire replied. "Especially that." He then turned his attention fully to Lena. "You didn't just fix a helicopter," he told her. "You exposed a blind spot." That caught her attention. "I didn't mean to," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." They moved to the lounge overlooking the hangar, a space enclosed by glass walls where executives usually watched operations from a distance. Today, that distance felt symbolic. Lena sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, unsure if she was allowed to relax. Food was brought in, simple, warm, familiar. She ate slowly, glancing up between bites, half expecting someone to tell her she didn't belong there. The billionaire asked questions, but not the kind she was used to. He didn't ask for proof or credentials. He asked how she learned to notice details, how she stayed patient, how she handled failure. Lena spoke about nights spent fixing broken things under streetlights, about trading repairs for food, about listening closely because mistakes were expensive when you had nothing to fall back on. She explained that machines made sense to her because they were honest. They didn't lie. They only reacted. The billionaire listened without interrupting. Each answer added weight to a realization, forming in his mind. Lena's intelligence wasn't raw, it was refined by survival. And survival had given her something most people with resources never developed: respect for consequences. When their conversation slowed, silence settled comfortably between them. The billionaire looked out over the hangar, then back at Lena. He saw not a problem to solve, but a future that had almost gone unnoticed. "Lena," he said carefully, "what do you want to learn?" She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that without strings attached. "How things really work," she finally said. "Big things. The kind people say you're not supposed to understand." The billionaire nodded. In that moment, his decision became solid, not impulsive, not emotional, but inevitable. He understood that helping her wasn't charity. It was responsibility. As Lena stood, preparing to leave out of habit more than intention, he stopped her gently. "You don't have to go back to the way things were," he said. "Not today." She looked at him, confusion mixing with cautious hope. Around them, the hangar continued its routine, unaware that a single overlooked voice had just rewritten the future for a girl, for a company, and for a man who thought he had already seen everything. The decision the billionaire made that day did not arrive with noise or spectacle. There were no reporters, no congratulatory statements, no carefully framed narrative designed to polish his reputation. Instead, it unfolded quietly, deliberately, shaped by a rare sense of responsibility rather than impulse. He understood that what stood in front of him was not a problem to solve quickly, but a life that could be either supported or unintentionally damaged by careless help. Rather than handing Lena a stack of cash or sending her away with vague promises, he chose involvement. Real involvement. The kind that required time, attention, and restraint. Within hours, arrangements were made not as charity, but as structure. Temporary housing was secured in a modest, clean place where Lena could lock a door and feel safe. Medical evaluations were scheduled, handled gently and without judgment. Fresh clothes were provided without ceremony, presented as normal necessities rather than gifts. At every step, the billionaire insisted on one thing: no publicity, no documentation, no storytelling. He was adamant that Lena would not become a symbol or a marketing piece. Her dignity mattered more than his image. Lena noticed this immediately. She had learned long ago to recognize performative kindness. This was different. Still, she was cautious. Years of instability had trained her not to trust sudden safety. When she asked, "What do you want me to do?" her voice carried the weight of experience. She expected conditions, expectations, debt. "I want you to learn," the billionaire said. "And I want you to decide what learning means to you." That answer unsettled her more than any demand would have. The weeks that followed were slow by design. Lena was introduced to structured environments for the first time: classrooms, workshops, engineering labs, but never pushed. The billionaire instructed his teams not to overwhelm her with opportunities. Choice, he believed, was as important as access. Engineers volunteered their time, initially out of curiosity, later out of respect. Some brought broken components, others brought theoretical problems. They quickly learned that Lena approached everything differently. She didn't rush. She didn't assume. She observed. Where others saw diagrams, she saw behavior. Where others followed checklists, she searched for patterns. Her questions were disarming, sometimes uncomfortable. Why is it built that way? What happens if this fails first? Who decided this was acceptable risk? More than once, her observations exposed flaws that had been accepted simply because they were industry standard. The billionaire watched all of this from a careful distance. His instinct to intervene to accelerate her progress, to provide every advantage immediately, was strong. But he resisted it. He understood that growth forced too quickly could break what it meant to nurture. Instead, he focused on clearing obstacles. He simplified bureaucratic barriers. He restructured internal programs to recognize unconventional intelligence. Apprenticeships were expanded. Mentorship became collaboration. Gradually, Lena began to change in ways that couldn't be measured on paper. She slept through the night. She stopped flinching at sudden noises. She began to sit back in chairs instead of perching at the edge. Safety, once foreign, started to feel real. And with safety came something new: curiosity, unburdened by fear. Months later, the billionaire invited her back to the hangar where it had all begun. The helicopter stood polished and flawless, fully operational, its presence no longer symbolic of failure but of transformation. He asked her to walk him through what she saw now. Lena spoke with confidence, not just about mechanics, but about design philosophy, redundancy, human error, and ethical responsibility. She had learned the language of engineering, but she hadn't lost her instincts. She still viewed machines as conversations between intention and consequence, not trophies of control. As he listened, the billionaire realized something that unsettled and humbled him deeply. Lena was no longer simply learning, she was contributing. In that moment, he understood that leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about creating rooms where intelligence could emerge, especially from places the world had taught him to ignore. That realization reshaped his companies, his priorities, and himself. And it all began because one girl was finally heard. The real transformation did not announce itself in sudden breakthroughs or dramatic headlines. It unfolded gradually, through decisions that rewired the billionaire's world from the inside out. What began as an effort to protect what overlooked girl became a confrontation with an entire system he had spent decades building and never truly questioning. As Lena settled into a rhythm of learning and exploration, the billionaire began to notice something unsettling. The more space she was given to think freely, the more flaws she exposed, not just in machines, but in processes, assumptions, and leadership itself. Meetings that once followed predictable patterns were now disrupted by new questions. Long-standing protocols were being quietly challenged. Not by rebellion, but by clarity. Lena was invited into discussions she technically had no title for. At first she sat silently, listening. Executives spoke in rehearsed language, carefully guarding their positions. Then Lena would ask a single question, simple on the surface, devastating underneath. What happens if this fails? Who fixes it when no one is watching? Why does the system punish mistakes instead of learning from them? The room would go quiet. The billionaire watched these moments carefully. He saw how often authority was mistaken for correctness. How frequently experience became an excuse to stop questioning. Lena wasn't trying to dismantle power, she was exposing its blind spots. And slowly, people began to listen. Not because she was extraordinary, but because she was honest. Inspired by this shift, the billionaire initiated deeper changes. Departments once isolated were forced to collaborate. Engineers were encouraged to spend time on the ground, observing how systems behaved outside controlled environments. Decision makers were required to explain not just what they chose, but why. The culture began to change, not toward softness, but toward accountability. Lena, meanwhile, struggled in ways no one anticipated. Growth brought conflict. Structure sometimes felt suffocating. Expectations created pressure she had never asked for. There were days she withdrew, overwhelmed by attention, by the fear of being misunderstood or used. The billionaire noticed and adjusted. He learned to step back, to protect her from becoming a spectacle, even within his own organization. One night, long after most employees had left, the billionaire found Lena alone in a lab, staring at a dismantled component. She wasn't working on it. She was thinking. "Do you ever worry?" she asked quietly. "That once people expect things from you, you stop being yourself?" The question struck harder than any boardroom challenge. "Yes," he answered honestly. "That's how I lost parts of myself." That conversation marked a turning point. The billionaire realized that success without reflection had turned him into someone who valued results over people. Lena had not only changed how he saw intelligence, she had changed how he understood responsibility. Over time, her influence extended beyond engineering. Training programs were redesigned to include problem-solving from real-world constraints. Outreach initiatives sought talent in places once ignored. Not as charity, but as strategy. The billionaire understood now that brilliance often survives despite the system. Not because of it. Years passed. Lena grew not into a symbol, not into a spokesperson, but into a thinker whose presence reshaped rooms quietly. She never sought authority, yet it followed her. She never demanded recognition, yet it emerged naturally. And the billionaire, once obsessed with control, found himself most fulfilled when he listened. He often returned to the hangar alone, standing beneath the helicopter that once refused to fly. He no longer saw a machine. He saw a moment when certainty failed in humility. succeeded. What Lena fixed that day was not an aircraft. She fixed a way of seeing the world. And that change rippled outward far beyond anything money could have bought. The final chapter of this story did not arrive with applause headlines or a sense of completion that could be neatly packaged and admired. There was no moment when the billionaire stood before an audience and declared that everything had come full circle. Life, he had learned, did not resolve itself that way. Instead, the ending unfolded slowly, almost quietly, through years of consistent choices that reshaped not only his world, but the people within it. Years had passed since the day the helicopter refused to fly. The billionaire was older now. Not diminished, just different. His posture still carried authority, but it was no longer sharpened by urgency or impatience. His companies had grown far beyond what they were back then, expanding into new industries, new regions, and new technologies. Yet paradoxically, his presence within them had become less dominating. He no longer entered rooms to control outcomes. He entered them to observe dynamics. Power, he had learned, was most effective when it stopped announcing itself. The culture within his organizations reflected that lesson. Meetings were no longer performances designed to impress leadership. They became working sessions, messy, honest, sometimes uncomfortable. Junior voices were encouraged to speak before senior ones. Assumptions were written down, challenged, and revisited. Decisions were no longer judged only by speed or profit, but by resilience, how well they would hold up when conditions changed or failed entirely. This shift could be traced back to a single realization the billionaire had never forgotten. Intelligence does not always look like authority, and expertise does not guarantee understanding. Lena was no longer a child standing barefoot in a hangar, watching adults argue over a machine they could not fix. Time had reshaped her in ways both visible and subtle. She carried herself with quiet confidence now, moving through complex environments without hesitation. Her speech was measured, her presence steady. But at her core, she was unchanged. She still listened more than she spoke. She still noticed what others dismissed as insignificant. She had been offered titles, many of them. Executive roles, public recognition, opportunities that would have placed her at the center of attention. She declined most of them without explanation. She preferred roles that allowed her to move between teams, across disciplines, and into places where problems were still undefined. Hierarchies bored her. Systems fascinated her. The billionaire respected this more than he ever said out loud. He had once believed that success meant climbing higher. Lena had taught him that sometimes the most important work happened horizontally, connecting people, ideas, and consequences that rarely met. Under her influence, though she never sought it, the billionaire's enterprises changed their priorities. Engineering teams were required to document not just solutions, but failures and assumptions. Design reviews included people who would never normally be invited: operators, maintenance staff, even external observers unfamiliar with the system. The question, "What happens when this breaks?" became mandatory, not optional. This philosophy extended beyond technology. Human systems were redesigned as well. Burnout was treated as a signal, not a weakness. Feedback moved upward as easily as it moved down. The billionaire insisted on one rule that baffled some and empowered others. Every system must be explainable to someone who didn't help build it. That rule came directly from Lena. She never designed in abstraction. She thought in terms of consequences: what happens when resources disappear, when plans fail, when people panic. Her understanding of the world had been shaped in environments where mistakes were not theoretical. They were immediate and irreversible. The billionaire came to understand that this perspective was not something education alone could provide. It was forged through exposure to reality without a safety net. And once he saw that truth, he could never unsee it. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, the billionaire returned to the old hangar. The helicopter that had started everything was gone, replaced years ago by newer, more advanced models. The floor had been repainted, the equipment upgraded. Yet the space still carried memory. He stood there alone, not thinking about the fix, but about the moment before it. The certainty with which experts had dismissed alternatives. The ease with which he himself had almost agreed with them. He thought about how close he had come to reinforcing a belief that would have cost him far more than a delayed flight. He realized then that the most dangerous failures were not mechanical. They were perceptual. Somewhere else, in a different city, Lena worked quietly on projects designed for resilience rather than prestige. Infrastructure meant for communities rarely mentioned in reports. Systems built to survive neglect, not showcase innovation. She surrounded herself with people who questioned each other without ego, who respected limits, and who understood that complexity demanded humility. When asked years later what had changed her life the most, she never spoke about helicopters, billionaires, or opportunity. She said, someone listened when they didn't have to. That answer followed the billionaire for the rest of his life, because he knew the truth behind it. His greatest legacy was not the wealth he accumulated, not the industries he influenced, not the machines that bore his name. It was the moment he learned to pause, to listen, and to accept that wisdom sometimes enters quietly, wearing clothes that don't belong in the room. The helicopter flew that day, but something far more important finally moved. A system learned to listen. And once that happens, nothing, absolutely nothing ever stays the same.